My name is Samantha Bragg, and I'll be doing my oral defense for our final paper. And I've been coughing all day, so if I cough, please excuse me. Okay, so the topic I did for my paper was water security, and I really focused on the case of Israel and Palestine. So what I tried to do in the beginning is kind of just touch on water scarcity and its effects, and I guess the effects that it has on the nations and regions where it takes place. So it's really hard for many of us to fathom that the world is actually running out of water. For those of us who do have easy access to clean water, it's hard to imagine a life struggling to find one of those, if not the most important resources. Researchers have definitely been, arguing and trying to tell us for years that if the world is not proactive, the declining amount of water will be at the forefront of conflict in countries struggling to obtain water. Many regions where water scarcity takes place it's a very real issue. And these regions aren't really equipped with any type. They're not equipped with any type of resources or capabilities to deal with the environmental changes, and they usually have governments that aren't able to ensure basic necessities like water to their people. Water scarcity can also allow for unfavorable economic effects and can become a source of human migration, which then causes an overflow of population in other regions. And from this, we kind of see a weakened state, which leads to things like ethnic conflicts, power struggles, and possibly even border conflicts. So the regions that do experience these type of shortages in resources, they tend to produce conflicts and not just water-specific or resource-specific conflicts. We've really seen that the U.S. and other nations have involved themselves to help secure stability in the hopes that this aid will really stop further conflict from arising in these regions. So I really focused on the case of Israel and Palestine. In many regions where there is a lack of water access, there's little to no policy in place to help resolve the issue. But in the case of Israel and Palestine, it's really different. They've gone through extensive negotiations and have introduced policies to kind of eradicate the issue of water scarcity there. But ironically, the water access negotiations seem to produce more results than any other peace negotiation between the two nations. Some might argue that this is because there's a recognized need for water to sustain life between the two. But peace between the two, on the other hand, isn't necessarily as much as a priority as water is to them. So it's really no surprise that Israel kind of has the upper hand in the region and pretty much dictates what is acceptable and what is not in these negotiations with Palestine. What I found really interesting about the two nations is that while Israel is really focusing on discussing new ways to work together and to find new or additional water resources, Palestine is really more focused on determining water rights. And this kind of ties into the cultural disposition between the two. And this disposition really comes into play when attempting to negotiate. There's a major hesitancy due to the distrust between Israelis and Palestinians. So the role that water plays in the Israeli and Palestinian relationships is a very unique one. Israel relies heavily on the water aquifer that originates in the Palestine-occupied West Bank. So that being said, Israel has really created and enforced very aggressive water management policies in the West Bank, and it's really reluctant to surrender that control over it. We begin to see these policies being implemented after the occupation in the 1960s, and they started to declare things like all water resources in the West Bank region were Israeli state property. We also saw a series of military orders that were issued by Israel, which ensured things like giving all authority over water to Israel officials, prohibiting construction of water installations without the proper permits, and declaring that all former disagreement settlements were now null and void. We wouldn't really see a change in these policies until the peace talks in the 1990s. Excuse me. It would be easy to assume that because there is a cooperation between the two nations when it does come to the water resource, that this cooperation might spill over into other areas of disagreement between the two. However, this isn't really the case. There's very little evidence to suggest that cooperation over fresh water has promoted cooperation in other areas. So the Oslo agreements that took place in 1993 through 1995 really detailed quantities of water from each of the West Bank aquifers that would be allocated to Israel and to the Palestinian Authority during the interim period until a final status agreement was really reached. Excuse me. So this kind of quantitative approach tends to use the option of dividing and allocating the resource, which really isn't feasible or always feasible due to the fact that we have no real control over a natural resource. So this method or approach is kind of difficult. Some scholars even go as far to argue that there should be a joint management institution between the two, and that it could lead to a positive sum game between the two because there'd be cooperation from both, and this is something they could both potentially gain from. I argue that this cooperative water policy, their effects could go one or two ways. One being the more positive way could be that these cooperative water policies allow for a greater cooperation between the two on bigger issues than just water resources. Excuse me. But there could also be negative effects as well. So if one country were to attempt to take more than it gives, it could cause an even greater conflict amongst the two. So the next real question I wanted to look at is if these policies have actually worked. So as I previously stated, there's been an extensive negotiation process between the two regarding water security. But I would argue that they have little to show for it. There's really little to suggest that these negotiations have done anything to correct the imbalance of water allocations between the two. And that idea of a joint management institution was kind of enacted in the 1995 interim agreement between Israel and Palestine when the Joint Water Committee was created. Although on paper this may seem like a really great resource, it kind of allowed for Palestine's dependency on Israel to continue and really gave Israel that, or still gave Israel that upper hand in the relationship. I would also argue that Palestine, they just really don't have the necessary resources and capabilities to successfully implement working water policies. I apologize. So, while it may be true that they don't have the necessary resources, we still can't discredit them, or their standing within the water negotiations with Israel. Whether or not Israel's capabilities are more advanced, they still need the cooperation of Palestine when it comes to this water regulation. So moving forward, I mentioned that there is a cultural disposition that plays a really vital role in the lack of true cooperation. And until those cultural differences are resolved, which will probably not be anytime soon, these issues such as water scarcity and the resolutions that need to be made, they'll never be handled or approached in a true manner. So, like I said earlier, Israel clearly has the upper hand and has ensured that their supply of water resource allows for their growth as a nation. And Palestine really lacks the drive to implement the proper policies and institutions needed. Should Palestine build its own water program and attempt to move away from its dependency on Israel, we may find that this cooperation between the two in water negotiations will be a lot more successful. My last arguing point is that once the two see each other as equal and not necessarily the upper hand, the lesser hand, then I think this cooperation will happen with a lot more ease. But for right now, any type of negotiation just seems a bit out of the question for the two. So that's all I have for this. I hope you've had a great semester and you get a bit of a break. It was a pleasure being your student, and I'll see you.